Hello everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'll tell you 5 creepy funeral stories. The first story is called Awakening in the Coffin. In a small town in the 19th century, a young woman passed away from a sudden illness. She was buried in the family crypt. A few days later, her relatives heard screams coming from the crypt. When they opened the coffin, they found that the lid had been scratched from the inside, and there were traces of blood on the woman's hands. It turned out she had been buried alive and had tried to escape. After the relatives discovered the woman's body with bloodied hands and scratches on the coffin lid, they were horrified. They decided to reinvestigate her death to understand what had really happened. The local doctor, who had confirmed her death, insisted that she was dead when she was buried. However, the strange events didn't end there. A few days after the coffin was opened, strange things began happening in the family's home. They heard footsteps in the attic, even though no one was there, and at night, soft crying could be heard coming from the deceased woman's room. One morning, the relatives found a note on the table written in the woman's handwriting, "Why did you leave me there?" The family turned to a local priest for help, who suggested performing an exorcism. That night, they gathered in the house to conduct the ritual. The priest began reciting prayers, but suddenly the lights went out, and the room turned cold. From the corner of the room, a whisper was heard, "I didn't want to die." Suddenly, a shadow appeared on the wall, slowly moving toward them. The priest, trembling, continued the prayer, but the shadow began to take the shape of a woman. It was her, pale, with empty eyes and bloodied hands. She whispered, "You must find the one who did this to me." The family was in shock. They began to suspect that the woman's death wasn't an accident. They contacted a local detective, who started an investigation. It soon came to light that the woman had been poisoned, and the main suspect was her husband, who had inherited a large fortune after her death. When the man was arrested, the strange occurrences in the house stopped. However, new oddities began at the cemetery where the woman was buried. People reported seeing her ghost wandering among the graves, and at night, they heard her voice singing an old lullaby. The family decided to move her remains to another location and hold a new burial ceremony. When the coffin was opened, they found that the woman's body looked as if she had just died, even though several months had passed. This time, they made sure she was truly dead and buried her with all the proper rituals. Since then, the woman's ghost hasn't troubled the family, but locals say that sometimes at night, a pale figure can be seen wandering among the graves, as if she's still searching for peace. The second story is called The Mirror in the Funeral Parlor. In one funeral home, staff noticed that the mirror in the viewing room kept fogging up, even when the room was dry and warm. One night, a security guard saw the reflection of a deceased person who had been buried the day before. The figure slowly raised its hand and pointed toward the door. The next morning, the guard quit, refusing to explain why. After the guard saw the reflection of the deceased in the mirror and quit, even stranger things began happening in the funeral home. The new guard also started noticing unexplained phenomena. The mirror in the viewing room continued to fog up, and at night, footsteps could be heard in the room, even though no one was there. One evening, the funeral home administrator, Miss Evelyn, decided to stay after work to figure out what was going on. She brought an old book of local legends, hoping to find a clue. As she sat in the viewing room, the mirror suddenly fogged up, and words appeared on its surface, "Free me." Miss Evelyn, trembling, approached the mirror and saw the reflection of a young woman in a white dress. The woman looked sad and reached out her hand as if trying to touch Miss Evelyn. Suddenly, the lights went out, and Miss Evelyn heard a whisper, "He trapped me here." The next morning, Miss Evelyn began her investigation. She discovered that many years ago, a man who worked at the funeral home was known for performing strange rituals. He allegedly used mirrors to trap the souls of the deceased so they couldn't leave this world. Legend had it that he was punished for his actions, but no one knew what happened to the souls he had trapped. Miss Evelyn decided to contact a local medium to try to free the woman's spirit. That night, they performed a ritual in the viewing room. The medium began summoning the spirit, and suddenly the mirror fogged up again. This time, the woman's reflection was clearer, and she began to speak. "He trapped me here so I couldn't tell the truth." It turned out the woman had been murdered years ago, and her killer had used dark rituals to hide his crime. Her soul had been trapped in the mirror to prevent her from warning others. The medium performed a liberation ritual, and the mirror shattered on its own. The room fell silent, and Miss Evelyn felt the heavy atmosphere lift. The next day, she found old newspapers reporting the woman's mysterious disappearance years earlier. She passed the information to the police, and the investigation was reopened. Since then, no strange occurrences have happened at the funeral home, but Miss Evelyn sometimes feels a slight chill when passing the spot where the mirror once hung. She knew the woman's spirit had finally found peace, but the mystery of her death remained unsolved. The third story is called Midnight Dance. At an old cemetery in Europe, locals claimed that every midnight, they heard music coming from an abandoned chapel. One day, a group of teenagers decided to check it out. They saw shadowy figures in funeral attire dancing around an open coffin. When they approached, the music abruptly stopped, and the shadows vanished. Inside the coffin, they found a body that looked as if it had just been placed there, even though the cemetery had been abandoned for decades. After the teenagers saw the dancing shadows and the open coffin, they fled in panic. The next day, they told a local historian who studied the town's legends. The historian, after hearing their story, turned pale and said it might be connected to an ancient ritual performed at the cemetery over 100 years ago. According to legend, in the 19th century, a family in the town practiced dark rituals. They believed they could resurrect the dead by making them dance to a specific melody. However, something went wrong, and the souls of the deceased became trapped between worlds, doomed to dance at midnight forever. The historian suggested the teenagers return to the cemetery with him to try to solve the mystery. That night, they heard the music again, coming from the chapel. Inside, they saw the same shadows dancing around the coffin. The historian, trembling, pulled out an old book of spells and began reading a text he believed could stop the ritual. Suddenly, the music stopped, and the shadows froze. One of the figures slowly turned toward them. It was a woman in an antique dress, her face veiled. She raised her hand and pointed at the coffin. The teenagers, shaking, approached and saw a photograph of their town from many years ago inside. On the back was written, "Stop them before it's too late." The historian realized the ritual had never been completed, and the spirits were trying to warn them about something important. The next day, they researched archival records and discovered that a new shopping mall was planned to be built on the site of the old cemetery. The historian suspected this could disturb the spirits and lead to terrible consequences. The teenagers and the historian tried to stop the construction, but no one took them seriously. The night before the work began, the music played again, louder and more ominous. The next morning, the construction site was in chaos, equipment was destroyed, and the ground was covered in footprints resembling dancing steps. Since then, the cemetery has remained untouched, but locals say that every midnight, you can hear music, and dancing shadows can be seen in the chapel windows. The fourth story is called Whispers from the Grave. In a village, a man buried his wife. A few days later, he began hearing her voice calling him from the grave. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the voice grew louder. One night, he couldn't take it anymore and dug up the grave. To his horror, his wife's body was in an unnatural position, and there were scratches on the inside of the coffin lid. The voice stopped, but the man could never sleep peacefully again. The man, horrified by what he saw, couldn't understand how she could have been alive after doctors had confirmed her death. Thinking it was a mistake, he turned to a local priest for help. The priest agreed to bless the grave. That night, they went to the cemetery together. As the priest began reciting prayers, the wind suddenly picked up, and a strange smell filled the air, a mix of rot and incense. The man heard his wife's whisper again, but this time it sounded sinister. "You shouldn't have come here." Suddenly, the ground around the grave began to shift, as if something was trying to break free. The priest, trembling, continued the prayer, but pale hands emerged from the earth, grasping at the air. The man stepped back in terror, and the priest shouted, "Run! That's not your wife." The next morning, the man returned to the cemetery. The grave was undisturbed, but there were footprints leading into the forest. He followed them and found an abandoned hut. Inside, he discovered an old book of spells and a photo of his wife taken years before they met. It turned out she had been involved in an ancient cult that practiced resurrection rituals. Her death had been part of the ritual, but something had gone wrong. The man burned the hut and the book, but from then on, he heard whispers every night, growing louder. One morning, he was found dead in his bed. On the wall, written in blood, were the words, "You shouldn't have interfered." The fifth story is called The Funeral That Never Ended. In a South American city, a family buried their grandfather. The next day, they found the grave had been dug up, and the body was gone. The police investigated but found no clues. A week later, the family received a letter written in the grandfather's handwriting, thanking them for the beautiful funeral and asking them not to look for him. Later, he was seen wandering the cemetery at midnight, but every time someone tried to approach, he disappeared. After receiving the letter, the family hired a private detective named Mark to investigate. Mark noticed the grave had been dug up carefully, as if by someone who knew what they were doing. He also found strange footprints leading from the grave into the nearby forest, too large for a human but too small for an animal. One night, Mark stayed at the cemetery to see if the grandfather would appear. At midnight, he heard footsteps and saw a figure wandering among the graves. It was the grandfather, but his movements were strange, as if he was being led. Mark tried to approach, but the figure vanished, leaving only a cold breeze. The next day, Mark followed the footprints into the forest, where he found an old hut hidden among the trees. Inside, he found strange symbols on the walls and an altar with a photo of the grandfather. On the altar was a book of spells, seemingly used for rituals. Mark realized the grandfather had been involved in something dark. He contacted a local historian, who explained that a cult in the area had once practiced resurrection rituals. They believed they could bring the dead back to life, but the cost was high. The soul of the deceased became a prisoner. Mark returned to the hut at night to gather more evidence. As he entered, he heard the grandfather's voice, "You shouldn't have come here." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the room turned cold. Shadows began moving on the walls as if alive. Mark tried to escape, but the shadows surrounded him. Suddenly, he heard the grandfather's voice shout, "Run!" Mark bolted for the door and escaped. When he looked back, the hut was engulfed in flames, though there was no fire. The next day, he returned, but the hut was gone, as if it had never existed. The family never learned the full truth, but they never received another letter. However, locals say that sometimes at night, a pale figure can be seen wandering the forest, as if still searching for a way home. Thanks for watching this video to the end. I'm really grateful. Leave a like and a comment. Let me know what other stories you'd like to see on my channel. Write your suggestions in the comments.